Well, everything was segregated and by law, transportation, occupation, and it was just one of those Southern traditions that was enforced in the schools. In 1954, after the Supreme Court decision had been handed down to do away with segregation in the public schools, we did have a few parents of school-age children in public schools to sign the petition and place it before the Board of Education. And when this was done, the Board of Education published the names and the addresses, so these people were open to any type of harassment that might be inflicted. I don't know now how many lost jobs. Maybe they didn't, but it was just one of those things that was done to make this segregation more oppressive and to intimidate us as a people. The murder of Emmett Till, I believe he was about 14 years old, who was visiting his relatives. His home was in Chicago, and the news came that he had been brutally murdered and put into the river. His body was removed from the river after it had been weighted down, and he was so badly mutilated he was unrecognizable. The first mass meeting that we had in Montgomery following his death was when Dr. T.R.M. Howard came to speak to the NAACP meeting, well, just a community meeting, and he was telling us about it in detail. And of course, the Jet magazine published it, and we read about it. But just like any person murdered, I couldn't be any way than very upset, very devastated by the fact that in the United States of America that a child could be just taken out and killed. However, it parallels an incident that had happened in Montgomery not too long before this, except this was a young minister who had a singing group, and my husband knew him and his mother. And he is supposed to have done something, I don't know what it was. I think some white woman had made a request that he had a radio program, a group of singers, and it seemed that she had made a request. I don't know whether it was by writing or how for his group to sing a certain song, and this is supposed to have led to him being in touch with this person, and some men took him out to the Alabama River on a bridge, and he's supposed to have jumped over into the river, and they told his mother she'd better keep quiet about it, which she did. My husband knew it, and I guess the family, and that was all. But the difference in his case and the Emmett Till case was because Emmett Till came from the North, and the media picked it up. And this case, of course, was kept very much hidden. So that is why around Montgomery, it was supposed to have been a good race relations, quote unquote, because much of what was done to some families, and I happened to be at that time the secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, as well as the youth council advisor, and many cases did come to my attention that nothing came of them because the persons who were abused would be too intimidated to sign an affidavit or to make a statement to let it be known what had happened. I had been active much further back than 1954. I had been working with the NAACP since 1943, and I worked with we set up registration lesson meetings for people to start becoming registered voters. Very few of us were registered in the early 1940s, and it was practically impossible for a black person, regardless of their intelligence, to become registered, except for a very few those selected by the white community. Well, when I would not give my money to the driver, or if I put the fare in and get on the bus, the driver who had me arrested did evict me from the bus in 1943, and it would those who wanted to enforce this type of oppression and humiliation would rather that I not ride the bus. In fact, some did tell me not to ride their buses, their bus, if I felt that I was too important to go to the back door to get on. And going to the back door after paying your fare in the front would mean sometimes that people wouldn't even get on the bus at all, because if he couldn't get around fast enough to suit the driver, he would just drive off and leave you standing after you paid your fare. Well, the system of legal racial segregation on the buses, the white passengers occupied the front seats and the blacks in the back. But there was I guess you'd say, custom or practice that if the back of the bus was filled up and people were standing in the aisle, they still would leave a certain number of vacant seats in the front, even if no white people boarded the buses. The times that if whites would get on the bus and occupy what was supposed to be the designated seats for them, and they were all filled, some drivers, not all, would have the first row of black people to stand, those that were just back of the whites, to accommodate those whites who were standing. So that was very humiliating, very oppressive, and even with having to take a certain section because of your race was also very humiliating, but having to stand up on the orders of a particular driver to keep a white person from having to stand was, to my mind, most inhumane. We were paying the same fare. And so in fact, some black people had to pay double fare because, as I mentioned earlier, if they were trying to get on the bus at the rear door, they would have to either walk where they were going after having paid the fare in the front, or pay another fare when they wait for another bus and pay another fare. More than 75, between 85 and I think 90% of the patronage of the buses were black people, because while there were some white people who used the buses, they were very much in the minority. And we were very much in the majority because most white people could own and drive their own cars than blacks. It was not a matter of me deciding that day because over a period of time, over the years, I had had problems with bus drivers. And this one who had me arrested on that day was the same one who had evicted me from the bus in 1943, which did not cause anything more than just hardly a passing glance. But I did have to leave the bus and find another way of transportation home or wait for another bus or walk. I don't remember which I did. I had finished my day's work as a tailor's assistant in the Montgomery Fair department store, and when I was on my way home, I noticed the first bus was very crowded, even people standing up in the front and the back. And I didn't get that one because I wanted to go to the store and pick up an item or two at the drugstore. The next Cleveland Avenue bus that I saw, I noticed I didn't see anyone standing up at that point, but by the time I walked to the bus and was getting on, there were some people in the back, standing in the back, and there was one vacant seat which I took alongside a man and the two women across the aisle. There were still a few vacant seats in the front. Of course, I was just getting on the bus. I was not counting any seats or trying to see what seats were vacant and what not. I was only concerned with the one that I was sitting in. We went through the next stop without being disturbed. But on the third, the front of the bus seats, the front seats were occupied, and there one man, a white man, standing. And at this point, the driver asked us to stand up and let him have those seats. And when none of us moved at his first words, he said, "Y'all make it light on yourselves and let me have those seats." And the man who was sitting next to the window stood up, and I made room for him to pass by me, and I sat where I was. The two women across the aisle stood up and moved out. Now, where they went or where they left the bus or where they stayed on, I don't know, because while he was stopping trying to get us to stand up, several people left the bus. I didn't see any white people leave. I don't know what happened to the passenger that he wanted to occupy the seat. I don't know whether he never said anything. All I know, it was a man. And when he saw me still sitting and that had left the 3 seats vacant, except for where I was, he asked me if I was going to stand up. I told him, no, I'm not. And he said, well, if you don't stand up, I'm going to have you call the policeman and have you arrested. I said, you may do that. And he did get off the bus and stayed for a few minutes, and I still sat where I was. And when 2 policemen came on the bus, the driver pointed me out, and he said that he needed the seats, and the other 3 stood, but that one, he just said that one would not. And when the policeman approached me, one of them spoke and asked me if the driver had asked me to stand. I said yes. He said, well, why don't you stand up? I said, I don't think I should have to stand up. And I asked him, I said, why do you push us around? He said, I do not know, but the law is a law and you're under arrest. But to my mind, and I had never read it in the city ordinance where a bus driver was supposed to have one passenger to stand up and not have a seat for another one to take the seat. As if I can remember correctly, it said that in keeping with racial segregation, the bus driver had I believe they said police power, which meant they could even carry arms if they wanted to rearrange seating in keeping with racial segregation. But that was not rearranging seating, that was just depriving 4 passengers of a seat for one person to sit down and leave 3 vacant seats while the back of the bus was packed with blacks standing. And there was only one white person who was standing. When I did get to the church, there were so many people in the street and around the church. It was very difficult for me to get in. Someone was trying to help me to get in, and then it was just packed. Every inch was taken up with people there, and then the street was full of people, and people were laughing and talking and seemed like they were quite happy. And when I did get to the meeting, I was escorted to the pulpit, and they had a seat for me there. And there were, so many people that you couldn't imagine that many getting into this church. I think they said there were several thousand. I don't know exactly how many, in and outside. Loudspeakers had been set up on the outside so those who could not get in could hear what was going on. And then there were a number of speeches. Many ministers and others spoke, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the speakers. And when there was a vote taken to decide whether the protest would continue as it had early that morning. It was on Monday, December the 5th, the date of my trial, and the evening was when this meeting was at the Hope Street Church. And the decision was unanimous. People were just yelling out that they would remain off the buses until changes were made for the better for us. Well, I was quite relieved and glad that people did decide that they themselves could take this action. It would attract enough attention to know that the masses of the people were not happy and were very much dissatisfied with the way we were treated. However, I felt like it was a bit long coming because there had been so many incidents when the same action could have taken place. But it seemed that they had not made up their minds until this particular incident.
Ralph Abernathy tells a story that there was a song sung at that first meeting at Hope Street Baptist Church, and everybody was singing it. Do you remember what that was?
I know they did quite a bit of singing, just what they actually sang, it's hard for me to remember. I guess it was maybe it was "Walk Together, Children, Don't Get Weary" or something like that. But I don't recall too many of the details of it.
How did you get to work during the boycott?
Well, the day after I was arrested, I used a cab, and other times I would walk, or maybe someone would give me a ride. It was reasonable walking distance of the downtown store where I worked. It would take anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes to get there, walking, less than an hour. And then there were some friends who had cars. And I don't recall, I didn't work too long after the incident. I worked 5 weeks, went through the month of December, and was discharged from my job after the first week in January.
What was your reaction to the Supreme Court decision of against segregation on the buses, and how did you hear about it?
We heard about it during one of our mass meetings, and Dr. King was presiding, and someone brought the message to him, and he gave it to us in the meeting.
What was your reaction?
Well, naturally, I would be very relieved to know that at last it had been handed down by the Supreme Court that the buses would not be segregated. But we had been off the buses now at that time for more than a year. We were used to not riding the buses then.
What how did you feel about getting back on the buses for the first time, and were you riding with King and any of the clergymen
No, I was not riding with them. In fact, I actually was not planning to ride the bus at all that day. My mother was quite ill, and I was at home with her, but some reporters from one of the publications, I think it was Look magazine, came to my home and asked if I would take a little time out and go downtown with them to have my picture taken riding.
What did that feel like, getting on that bus again?
I didn't feel any special way, just a matter of getting on for some of my picture to be taken. And the driver who had me arrested was one of the drivers. I think I must have was on and off about 3 buses before they finally got all the pictures that they wanted. And he was one of the drivers on whose bus I was getting on for the picture to be taken. But during that time, because there were so many other people involved, I did not feel any discouragement. I just felt that with the number, the masses of the people being involved and taking a part, that it was not as discouraging as it had been before the incident and before others joined in. When you feel like others are with you, I don't think you feel it discouraging. You may feel apprehensive about the safety of some of the people, or you may get weary because of meetings and well, my mother was ill quite a bit, and there were times when I could not participate as much as I wanted to, but when she recovered, then, well, she always went with me, and also my husband would go to some of the meetings. He was very shaken and very upset because of well, over a number of years, we had lived under this tension for so long until it really didn't make it worse for others to be working with us. It made it even better, as bad as it was then. But the only difference was that the public knew about it, and the media and newspapers, magazines, TV gave the protests a great deal of publicity.
I was just wondering, here you are together, and then they have this Authoring Lucy case come down, and they have the bombings, and then the NAACP outlawed. It just seemed like you would sag from the weight of all.
Well, we didn't sag at all. We just kept moving on because there wasn't any need then. Because if I could stand the 20s, the 30s, 40s, and the 50s, all those years without any mass cooperation or any support from either black or whites too much. Yeah, Mr. E.D. Nixon was the very first person who told me the importance of registering and becoming a voter. He and quite a few of the community people, my husband included, organized a voters league, we called it, where we met at each other's homes and Attorney Arthur A. Madison, a native Montgomery who came down from New York City to help us with our registration. His aim was to get us registered without having to be approved by some white registered voter. We worked with that as well as with the NAACP. Mr. Nixon was at times president, and then when he wasn't president, he was the chairman of the Legal Redress Committee. And whenever any incident or anything happened in the community, we always called on him. And so he was the very first person who was notified by a friend of mine that I was in jail. The call that I was permitted to make was to my home, and I spoke with my mother and my husband and told them that I was in jail. And my husband did find someone to give him a ride to the jail to release me. But in the meantime, Mr. Nixon, attorney and Mrs. Clifford Durr were there, and they made bond for me before my husband arrived. And so he was the first person beside my husband and my immediate family, my mother, to really impress upon me the freedom that was ours, and we would have to take a stand to at least let it be known that we want to be free regardless of the conditions under which we were living. And as the time I was on the bus and refused to stand up, it was principally because I felt that my rights as a human being was being violated, and that giving in and obeying the order of the driver was not helping to make conditions better for me or any of the rest of us. And it was the only way that I knew to let him and all the world know that I wanted to be a respectable and respected citizen in the community.